The red dust of Red Canyon was never still. The desert wind licked the ground, swirling into ghostly columns of dust, then breaking apart under the scorching sun. Anyone who had ever set foot in this corner of Kansas would say the land had an acrid smell, a mix of old wood ash, horse sweat, and something sour like dried blood. Elijah Boone didn't disagree. He had stayed for 8 years, letting the wind blow through his tangled black hair each morning and remind him why he was hiding from the world. It was the early spring of 1881. In the morning's first light, frost still clung to the cacti, but the sun was already glowing like embers in a forge. Elijah stood by an ancient cypress, his hand stroking the mane of a young chestnut colt. The animal startled with a soft whinny at the distant sound of a gunshot from the town of Dustvale, nearly a 2-day ride away. Elijah froze for a beat. The metallic echo struck an old memory. The sound of a bugle, the roar of cannons, the screams in the black smoke of Tennessee. He clenched his jaw and dropped his hand. Easy. Boy Raimanus. Einer Moiser, he whispered in a raspy voice, soothing the trembling colt. He had named him Sundown, because ever since Clara died, sunset no longer meant an end. For Elijah, it was just the changing of the guard for the darkness. Nearly 200 miles to the southeast, Dustvale was alive with the sound of fiddles and laughter. It was Opal Greaves' wedding day. The pine church was adorned with bright yellow wild daisies, and the pews, polished with varnish, smelled of resin. Pastor Matthew Greaves, the bride's father, recited from the scriptures about the 100-year vow in a majestic voice. In the front row, women wore lace veils, and men wore silk ties the color of gunpowder smoke. Everyone thought this wedding was a perfect portrait of Kansas's small high society. A gentle schoolteacher, a virtuous accountant, a spring wedding, a blessing from God. It was perfect until Walter Hale the groom blinked as if dust had flown into his eyes. He shifted, swallowed hard, and then spoke in a voice that was shaky but firm. Pastor, and everyone, I'm sorry, I cannot continue. Yesterday, the doctor, confirmed that Opal is unable to bear children. A family must have children. Otherwise, Opal's face turned as white as an unlined sheet of student paper. A few gasps of good heavens escaped. Chairs shuffled, and skirts rustled. Someone dropped a hymnal, the sound of its leather cover hitting the floor stark and dry. Opal didn't cry. Her breath felt like a stone lodged in her chest. When the church doors closed behind her, the sound of the latch clicking was exactly like a verdict. Sheriff Servitorn, her father, Pastor Matthew, invited his daughter into his study, dimly lit by an oil lamp. No one hugged her. No one wiped her tears. He placed his hand on the Bible, his voice as cold as well water in October. You have shamed the church and the Greaves family. I can no longer keep you in Dustvale. It is best that you leave. Pray elsewhere. And do not let me hear people whisper. Opal nodded, her back unusually straight. She went home, leaving behind the veil, leaving behind the wardrobe filled with tablecloths embroidered with the letter G. 2 weeks later, the wild wind blew through the Dustvale post office, carrying a notice pasted on the community board. Woman needed for ranch work. Remote location. Room and board provided. Pay based on ability. No personal questions asked. The last 4 words were like a lit window in a rainy night. Opal gripped the edge of the paper, rubbing her thumb over the smeared ink as if to thank the poster for their discretion. Before dawn the next day, she boarded the mail coach, carrying only a worn canvas suitcase, a half-finished basket of knitting, and a book of poetry by Henry Longfellow. Red Canyon welcomed Opal with the pungent, acrid smell of clay that had been baked in the sun for too long. The canyon walls were stained a deep red, like a web of scars on a conqueror's chest. When the coach wheels stopped in front of the Boone Ranch, the sky was still ashen, and crows were scattered like sentinels on the fence posts. Elijah opened the wooden door, a smoky oil lamp in his hand. His face was sun-scorched, stubbled with a beard, and his eyes were as gray as the sky after a sandstorm. He wasn't surprised to see a woman with a straight back and dust-covered boots, but whose eyes held the familiar flame of someone who had lost everything and was still standing. Opal spoke first, her voice hoarse from the long journey. I saw the notice. I'm a good worker, better with unruly students than young colts. Elijah just nodded. He didn't care about the past. He cared if a person could endure the harsh winds of Red Canyon. So, right after the greeting, he exhaled sharply. You can't live here alone. The folks around here will talk, unless We get married on paper. Opal pressed her lips together. She remembered the whispers in the church, her father's face as he held the gospel high like a blade. She nodded. If it makes the work go smoothly, I agree. The wedding took place as the evening sun stained the cliffs red. The witnesses, Duke Ray Wantanemorn, an old dog who had lost an ear in a tornado last year, and Molly, a lazy mare, a traveling preacher, Father Wilkes, on his way to a military fort 70 miles away, stopped by to perform the perfunctory ceremony. No rings, no kiss, just signatures and a drop of red wax sealing the marriage certificate. After the rite tune, Opal took off her gloves, rolled up her sleeves, and began to shovel manure from the stables. Elijah watched, about to intervene, but stopped himself. He went back inside, leaving a pair of brand new leather gloves on the kitchen table. That was their wedding night. The next day, the calls of wild turkeys echoed through the canyon. Opal cooked breakfast, dried beans stewed with smoked ham, and flour biscuits baked on a cast iron skillet. Elijah ate in silence, offering only a curt thank you. But before heading to the stables, he placed a Damascus steel dagger by the sink and said, "Rattlesnakes don't like a shiny blade," a Western-style compliment. On the third night, a northern wind blew sand through the cracks in the door. Opal sat at the pine table, sewing a cloth bag for cactus resin and mint leaves. Elijah was mending a saddle, occasionally glancing over. He saw that Opal's hands had calluses from chalk, but the needle moved as smoothly as flowing water, a rare patience in a land where everything was dry and cracked. He turned away, a tiny smile no one could catch forming on his lips. On the fifth day, Opal sketched a plan for a new stable, a low roof to avoid the wind, with windows facing south to catch the sun. She explained it clearly. Elijah just gave a slight nod, and that evening, he brought home a new Mexican rope, as tough as a buffalo's neck. Opal understood. That was his approval. On the eighth day, she planted onions, kale, and sage behind the ranch. At the base of each plant, she placed a small stone, a silent ritual. Like a prayer, folks from Dustvale who passed by to sell salt saw the rust-iron bride toiling away, digging a water trough. They snorted. Boone married her for convenience. She's as withered as winter grass. Elijah pretended to be deaf. But every night, Opal brewed mint tea, setting out 2 cups. One for her, one waiting for him. Some nights he would come in, the warm steam of the tea rising to his face, and his chest would suddenly feel lighter, as if someone had just lifted a saddle from a horse's back after a long journey. In the pre-dawn hours of the 12th day, the shriek of a horse tore through the night. The stable was ablaze. Elijah sprinted over, cut the ropes, and opened the stable gate, the flames licking at his leather jacket. In the burning hay, a rattlesnake slithered frantically, its empty tail rattling. Elijah cracked his whip. The snake struck his forearm and vanished, leaving 2 bleeding punctures. Opal didn't scream or cry. She helped Elijah sit against a post, pulled out the Damascus dagger, lanced the bite, and squeezed out the venom. 7-year-old corn whiskey was poured directly onto the red flesh, the acrid smoke stinging their eyes. Elijah gritted his teeth, sweat dripping, his ears ringing, but his gaze was locked on Opal's face, as calm as the rock face behind her. She bandaged the wound and kept watch all night. As the sky turned gray, she dozed off by the windowsill. Elijah quietly got up and placed an old Union Army blanket over her shoulders. He no longer had his Southern uniform. This star-spangled blanket was a spoil of war, traded for his life in a trench. He hated the symbol, but he hated the thought of Opal shivering even more. At noon, when Opal woke, a book lay on the kitchen table. Cavalry Tactics, Volume 2, its leather spine cracked, with an eagle feather marking a page on defending the camp perimeter from raiders. On the next page, in brown ink, was a note. I have never met anyone so calm under fire. It was signed only E. B. That same afternoon, the sound of hooves echoed from the slope. The rider wore a navy blue frock coat and had the cunning smile of a hunter. Jarvis Langdon, an opium trader, crossing Red Canyon to transport his goods to Colorado. He didn't like Boone's land sitting astride his shortcut. Langdon tipped his hat, his shifty gaze fixed on Opal, who was repairing a windmill. Fine land. A pity its keeper doesn't know how to grow money. Elijah's eyes met his, cold as ice. From then on, blood and smoke began to stalk the March skies. The early wind swept across the rusted tin roof, whistling like an overtuned guitar string. Opal pulled up the collar of her cloak and stepped onto the porch as the sky slowly brightened to a gray copper hue. Today, she planned to remove the rotten beam from the old stable roof and reset the south-facing window frame to let the sun in the sun would warm the cracks on the colt's back. She believed. Elijah was already awake. He stood silently in the yard, one hand holding Sundown's reins, the other lightly touching the horse's forehead, his whispers softer than the rustling grass. When Opal approached, if she couldn't machine the one, he had already saddled up and turned to her. A dust storm will sweep through the canyon this afternoon. We have to get the herd to the high ground before noon. I'll finish the new stable. Then I'll bring water up at noon. Elijah started to object. He didn't want her battling the harsh sun alone, but Opal's gaze was as hard as a driven nail. He nodded. The coming storm was no match for the will of the Dustvale school teacher once she declared she will. Opal climbed onto the stable roof, the rotten wood creaking under her boots. The leather gloves Elijah had given her fit snugly, still smelling of horse grease. Each hammer strike sent red dust flying into her stinging eyes. She lowered the beam, tied a rope, and let it down to the ground neatly, the discipline of her old classroom now harder than steel. The sound of hooves echoed and then faded. Elijah had moved the herd to the high rocks. She was alone on the roof, the wind raging through the canyon. On the horizon, brown dust rose like a pack of wolves, growling. She finished the window and slid down the rope ladder just as the first gust of wind hit. At that moment, an old ox cart swayed into the yard. On the bench sat a woman of about 50, her hair wrapped in a dark scarf, her coat patched but her eyes bright and shrewd. Came to see how that rattlesnake bite is treating young Boone. She cackled, revealing a gap-toothed smile. I'm the Maeve Carter. I sell herbs and rumors. Opal invited her into the kitchen. Mrs. Carter looked around, inhaling the faint scent of mint in the tea. His arm is better, Opal said, out of pouring the tea. But the worst sickness in Red Canyon is in the hearts of men. Mrs. Carter let out a throaty laugh. Young lady, you've hit the nail on the head. She leaned forward and whispered. Jarvis Langdon just ordered 5 crates of nitro through Poste Restante to be sent to Dustvale. He's digging a tunnel through the mountain. Anyone who gets in his way will be eating explosion dust. Opal's hand tightened around her cup, the hot mint scalding her fingers. The wind shrieking outside the walls echoed like a ghost train's whistle. By midday, red sand was slapping against the shutters. Elijah returned, his pants caked in a thick layer of dust. He saw Opal pulling a canvas tarp to block the door cracks. She tied a perfect sailor's knot, a knot he recognized from mooring boats, one he hadn't taught her. Where did you learn that? The library, she replied, then nodded towards the pasture. Is the herd safe? They're fine. I put up a temporary barbed wire fence, but he glanced over his shoulder. The dust storm swirled over the cliff tops like smoke from a forge. The wind will tear the unfinished roof off the stable. Then we'll brace it with support beams. They worked side by side, barely speaking. Elijah held the beam steady. Opal passed the ropes, his hands, which once trembled at the sound of wind howling like cannon fire, were now steady, following her lead. By noon, the sand was up to their calves. Opal coughed dryly. Elijah took off his scarf and wrapped it around her nose and mouth, his voice hoarse. Wind and the shitshibun was sunborn. Behind the dust, the air is still breathable. Just trust me. A short while later, the wind shifted, and the storm whipped past, moving west as fleeting as a cavalry raid. The moment of quiet that followed was thick, so quiet you could hear both their heartbeats. As evening fell, the sky cleared. Opal started a fire, cooking salt pork with beans and boiling a bunch of the first kale she had just cut. Elijah turned a tin cup in his hands, his eyes resting on a stack of dusty textbooks on the kitchen shelf. Do you miss it? Ifurda Shayan, leaving the schoolhouse. Opal looked up, a little surprised he had started the conversation. I do, but the children in Dustvale were whispering, the barren teacher, Shuri, and their fathers told them to stay away from the cursed one. Would it have been good for them if I had stayed? Elijah was silent. Something flickered in his eyes, a familiar ache. People are quicker to believe in a curse than in courage. He said, I used to believe a flag would protect my family. It was just a piece of cloth. Opal nodded. The smell of fennel rose from the cooking pot, mingling with the distant cry of a coyote, a sound found only in the nameless wilderness. The night covered Red Canyon like India ink. Elijah took a lamp to check the new stable. Opal was organizing her medicine table by the kitchen door. She heard the sound of hooves, not Sundown's heavy tread. This was light, hurried, furtive. She blew out the lamp, holding her breath. Through a crack in the door, the moonlight cast a pale glow on the figure of a stranger in a navy blue coat, Simon, Langdon's gaunt henchman she had seen lurking around Dustvale. He was fumbling around the storage shed, his hand holding something long. The main one had run out of circuit and shiny. Opal moved as silently as a cat, stepping off the back stone stoop and circling past the cabbage patch to the wall's deep shadow. She raised her slingshot, the one she used to scare away animals from her vegetables, a steel ball already loaded. Simon bent down to the door latch. A soft thwack echoed as the ball hit the back of his hand. He yelped and drew a small knife, but Elijah had already emerged from the shadows, a Remington pistol pointed at his waist. Opal stood 3 paces away, her chestnut hair blowing wildly. Her hand gripped the slingshot, but her gaze was as calm as when she corrected spelling. Elijah asked quietly, "Who sent you?" Simon gritted his teeth. His eyes darted from the gun to Opal's hair. He spat and hissed, "Langdon will own this land sooner or later." Elijah didn't shoot. He tied him to a post, intending to hand him over to the Dustvale authorities in the morning, though he knew Langdon had them in his pocket. But a bullet wouldn't close the case. Only the fear sown in the intruder's eyes would serve as a warning. Opal helped pull Simon to a sitting position, silent, when the ropes were tight. She offered a clean cloth for his wounded hand. He stared, gasping. She spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "The one who dresses your wound isn't afraid of blood. And you? Are you afraid of the red dust haunting your sleep from now on?" At midnight, the wind died down. The moon waned. Opal poured mint tea, not asking Elijah if he wanted any, but he closed the door himself and sat opposite her, his hand resting on the safely locked Remington. "Tomorrow afternoon," so he began, "I'm going to Dustvale to report to the sheriff. Messa, can you watch Santiniman? Can you stay here? I'll watch the stable and clear the shed. Add some more sandbags against the north wall." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why aren't you afraid? Langdon isn't the type to make idle threats." Opal set her cup down, looking up over the white rim of steam. "I once stood before a church full of people who despised me. That was fear. But this," she raised her hand, grasping the darkness, "this red earth just needs someone to plant a dream in it. I'm not running anymore." Elijah nodded, his gray eyes softening. The wind on the porch made the door creak. Sundown snorted as if in agreement. The 2 teacups were empty, the minty steam mingling with the embers in the fireplace to create a fragrance no bustling city could have. In that silence, something was left unsaid, but it was as solid as the hewn wood in the new stable, something that would endure many more storms but would be hard to break. The next morning, the sun was as fierce as if the night's wind had only been a hurried breath of the desert. Opal pulled on her canvas coat and stepped out into the yard. Simon had been tied securely to the porch post by Elijah, his face haggard from lack of sleep and pain. On the red trail leading to Dustvale, a long plume of dust had already risen. Elijah and Sundown had just disappeared behind the cypress grove. Opal carried a wooden bucket, drew water from the well, and poured it into the trough. When the water hit the zinc, it turned a cloudy, opaque color. She frowned a faint, metallic taste. Someone had dropped ore powder into the well during the night. She remembered Maeve Carter's words. "Langdon buys nitro, and he buys rusty blades too." She brought a ladle back, threw a few pieces of activated charcoal into the well, and then worked the pulley, replacing the water at least 10 times. By high noon, sweat soaked the nape of her neck, but the water was clear again. Simon watched, his eyes shifty. When she temporarily untied him to take a sip, he hissed softly, "You're wasting your time. Tomorrow Langdon will fill in the whole well." "What will you live on then?" Opal stood up straight. "Men break rocks to find water. I break ground to find sprouts. Do you know how to dig deep? Or do you only know how to mix poison and then tremble?" Simon fell silent, his bandaged hand numb. Opal tied him back to the post, adding a sailor's knot, a small detail. But it was enough to say her hands were not shaking. By late afternoon, the sound of hooves echoed back. Elijah appeared with 2 strangers riding behind him. Deputy Clive Harrington, his eyes dark-ringed under a wide-brimmed hat, and a dark-skinned corporal from the patrol. They dismounted, looked at Simon, glanced at the well, glanced at Opal. Harrington sniffed, his voice a mix of pine resin and tobacco smoke. "Mrs. Asoritunasan, Boone, Arcturus and Ardine, we'll take the suspect into custody. But Jarvis Langdon, it's difficult. He donates money to build bridges, funds the telegraph station. Without evidence, the district court can't. Opal cut him off. The well was poisoned this morning. The rusty lock on the shed was broken last night. I kept the steel ball I pulled from his hand. It has the mark of Langdon's forge. She took out a cloth bag and placed the blood-crusted steel ball in Harrington's hand. The deputy adjusted his collar, pressing his lips together. All right, I'll write a receipt, he said, blinking at Elijah as if in apology. As for security, the county will send 2 cavalrymen to patrol nightly. Elijah's voice was low. I need lumber, nails, and tin roofing. The ranch roof is damaged. If Mrs. Boone signs a request for aid, the county could. Elijah crossed his arms, looking straight at him. Sending papers to Topeka takes 6 weeks. By the time it's approved, there'll be nothing left but ashes. Harrington fell silent, tapping his pen on his hat. Finally, he turned to the corporal and ordered him to take Simon away. Before mounting his horse, he said to Opal, I can't promise anything, but I'll stop by Stacks and Sawmill, tell them to sell to Boone on credit. Then the patrol departed. As the sound of hooves faded, a purple-pink sunset washed over the rock ledges. Elijah led Sundown into the stable, his voice hoarse. Dermain Duman. Langdon has bought the deputy too, but he still has a bit of a conscience. He hung his wide-brimmed hat on a peg. We have to fortify the ranch before the new moon. Langdon likes to strike in the darkest nights. Opal nodded, her fingers touching the slingshot at her hip. I'll mix clay and straw to patch the north wall. You handle the roof. They divided the work. No more words needed. The night descended as smoothly as oil, but the sky tightened. The thin crescent moon wasn't bright enough to see by. Elijah stoked the stove, checked his guns, and walked the perimeter of the stable. Opal was in the shed, soaking a new rope in salt water to make it tougher. The wind suddenly gusted, pushing the shed door open with a creak. She stepped out just in time to see a figure run along the cabbage patch and disappear into the darkness. Opal knelt, placing her hand on the soft earth, the deep imprint of a large boot. She bent low and smelled the distinct odor of tar mixed with nitroglycerin, the same smell that came from the Silverton mines, often carried by smugglers. She ran to the porch and banged twice on a wooden barrel, the emergency signal. Elijah immediately extinguished the oil lamp and slipped out behind the stable. The wind whipped dust into their stinging eyes. Suddenly, a metallic clatter from under the old wagon. Elijah crawled on his stomach, knife in hand. A slow-burning fuse was hissing, connected to a wooden crate marked with the Langdon Freight Co. Logo number. He swung the knife, cutting it quickly, pressed the fuse into the dirt, and covered it with sand. His heart pounded. The fuse had already burned half a hand's length. He exhaled, his back drenched in sweat. Opal pulled a tarp over the crate, whispering, Tonight he sets a charge to scare us. Tomorrow he'll probably come for the deed to the land. Elijah nodded, his eyes flashing. We'll switch roles. Tomorrow, you go into Dust Vale. What for? No one will expect you to go straight to the Thistle Saloon to eavesdrop on Langdon. He meets with his advisor. Harker, Surnikunam, there every dawn an hour before the market opens? Opal started to argue Elijah rarely let her take risks, but he took her hand, his thumb warm and trembling. You're not just a stable hand. You're smarter than that nitro peddler. If we find out his plan, we can stop it. She looked into his eyes, gray ash mixed with the orange glow of the stove fire, and then nodded. If I'm not back by evening, take the herd across his Drybone Creek and make camp to the north. Elijah squeezed her hand, calloused from chalk. They said no more, just stood together watching the mountains rise and fall under the moon, a scene as silent as an unlined canvas. Dawn, Satir. Opal wore a long duster coat, concealing a small caliber pistol in a side pocket. She rode Molly, taking a narrow path along the east side of Red Canyon. The sound of hooves on dry rock was stark. In the sky, black crows circled, cawing like a bad omen. As Dustvale gradually appeared with its low wooden roofs and leaning chimneys, the smell of cornbread filled the morning mist. Opal tied her horse in front of the blacksmith's, then walked towards the Thistle Saloon, wedged between a leather goods shop and a pharmacy. The Thistle wasn't fully open yet. Only a sliver of yellow light seeped through the curtains. Opal went to the market, bought 2 aromatic leaves, and then slipped into the alley beside the saloon. She climbed onto a wooden step at the back of the building, pressing her ear against a crack in the wooden wall. Inside the saloon, Jarvis Langdon's voice was hoarse. Think about it. Hark Skunawarn. Harker Hrastar. Boone has no men. On the new moon, I'll blow up the ranch. Blame it on Simon escaping for revenge. The sheriff listens to me. The next morning, the land goes up for auction, and I'll win the bid. Clear the way to transport nitro to Colorado before the floods. Another voice even but menacing. We have to be sure Boone can't escape with his herd. He's got 100 head. He could sell them at Fort Garland for a big profit. Blow it up. Yes, Russia be worm. But we also have to block his escape route from the canyon. Opal shivered slightly. She moved away from the wall, about to retreat. A rotten floorboard cracked. Inside, a chair scraped, and Harker fell silent. The sound of boots seemed to be approaching the back door. Opal took another step back, her heel hitting an empty can that clattered loudly. She was exposed. She spun and jumped down the steps. The saloon's back door burst open, Harker brandishing a pistol. Opal dashed through the alley, dodging a pile of wooden barrels. A bullet whizzed past, embedding itself in the pharmacy sign, sending splinters flying. The people in the morning market turned in shock. A town marshal blew his whistle. But when he saw Harker flash a special railroad security badge, he froze in confusion. Opal turned a corner, hugging the side of the street and ducking into Stackson's blacksmith shop. The forge glowed, the blacksmith reeking of sweat. She waved to the owner. Let me use the coal tunnel. Stackson had been one of her father's old students. He recognized Opal and opened the lid to an old cellar that led to the woodpile. She slid down coal dust, filling her nose, and crawled through the narrow, dark passage to an opening near the stables behind the street. When she climbed out, Molly whinnied in response, as if she had already smelled her owner. Opal mounted and kicked her heels. She burst out of the narrow alley onto the main road, leaving the shouts of pursuit behind her. Leaving Dustville, so she didn't take the main road back. Langdon would surely have men following. Opal turned west, circling through a marshy field and following Drybone Creek. The noon sun was fierce, the muddy water swirling with hot wind. She stopped by the bank, took a drink of water, and hastily wrote on a piece of paper. Blow up ranch on new moon, Block Canyon. Marshall is in on it. She stuffed it into a leather tube tied to Molly's leg, slapped the horse's rump to send her back to the ranch, while she herself climbed a rocky bank to hide her tracks, continuing through the forest on a narrow footpath. 3 hours later, Opal reached an old walnut tree 2 miles from the ranch when she saw a thin column of smoke rising Elijah's emergency signal. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her ears. As she reached the fence line, sundown burst from behind a rock. Elijah in the saddle, a Spencer rifle at the ready. Seeing her, he let out a sigh of relief and signaled for her to take cover. 3 of Langdon's men have set up a barricade in South Fork Canyon. Another group is hiding behind the slope. I lit the straw as a signal so you wouldn't walk into a trap. Opal handed him the note. Elijah read it quickly, his brow furrowed. They plan to blow it up tomorrow night. We have to move the horses across Drybone tonight, but the canyon is blocked. Opal swallowed the hot air. They forgot about Coyote Ridge, a narrow rock path, only wide enough for 1 horse at a time. But they can't plant explosives there because of the strong winds. Elijah clapped her on the shoulder. You lead the young ones. I'll cover the rear with the Spencer. We leave as soon as the moon clears the cliff. They divided the work. Opal went along the stables, stroking each horse's mane, tying water bags to the saddles. The animals sensed the danger, snorting, their tails slapping restlessly. She whispered, be calm. The red earth will be safe by dawn. The night fell like a spilled inkwell. The new moon hung like a thin scythe in the west. Opal opened the gate, leading with sundown, with Molly bringing up the rear. Elijah rode along the flank, his Spencer loaded with 5 rounds. They left the Boone Ranch, the house silent under the shadow of the cliff, the light from the fireplace glowing through a crack in the door like a watchful eye. At the turn of Coyote Ridge, the wind howled, gusting straight up the cliff face, carrying fine sand. The horses climbed the slope, their hooves clattering, pebbles sliding. Opal led the way, her hand stroking Sundown's neck to calm him. A young colt slipped, whinnying in pain, but she reached out to guide its head, steering it to a flatter path. Elijah covered the rear, his eyes scanning below flickering torches, the sound of curses echoing up. Langdon's men had discovered the path. Elijah raised the Spencer and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet striking a rock and sending sparks flying just in front of the enemy's horses. They stopped. And sight spooked. The torches swung wildly. Unsure of where the shot came from, Elijah reloaded and fired a second round into a high rock face, causing a shower of debris, forcing them to take cover. He knew the strong wind would alter the bullet's path. The goal was only to delay. Opal led the herd over the crest of the ridge. As the last horse cleared the edge, she looked back to see Elijah retreating, his back against the rock, his gun empty. She shouted over the wind, "Jump on!" He dashed forward, grabbed Molly's mane, and swung himself onto the saddle behind her. The herd sped up, sliding down the northern slope, dust kicking up like a red wave. Below, Langdon's torches were stuck at the high cliff, unable to aim in time. Only curses carried on the wind. At the bottom of the slope, the group stopped by the bank of Drybone Creek. The marsh water was shallow, the rocks jagged, but there was enough to drink. Opal bent down and filled her canteen, her hands trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Elijah dismounted, ejected the empty shells from his Spencer, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" "Just a scratch." She touched her cheek. A gash from a cactus branch was bleeding slightly. Elijah took his kerchief, soaked it in water, and wiped it gently. His breath was close to her skin, smelling of wood ash and salt sweat. Opal shivered slightly, not from the pain, but because for the first time, she felt the sandstorm in her heart grow still. The horses drank their fill and stood huddled in a circle under the stars. Elijah let out a small laugh. "We'll make camp here. At dawn, we'll cross the salt flats to Fort Garland. Langdon won't dare cross into military territory." Opal nodded. "And the Boone Ranch?" He squeezed her hand firmly. "Wood can burn. The earth doesn't. We'll rebuild. But first, we have to save the dream this herd." Opal looked down at the water, glittering with reflected stars in her shadow. Elijah's hand was intertwined with hers, as steady as a post driven deep into the red earth. The night wind from Drybone Creek blew cold on the back of her neck, but somewhere in her chest, a fire was slowly kindling, the fire of two people who had once lost everything, now warming each other with the determination not to retreat. Far to the south, an unusual fire flared, painting the horizon red. Jarvis Langdon had blown up the empty Boone Ranch in the new moon's darkness. Thinking he had won, Opal looked up, her eyes reflecting the distant flames. "Red as blood," she murmured. Elijah replied, "But blood sustains life. Let's see what lesson the red earth teaches him." They stood still until the distant fire faded to a dim smudge, then returned to the small campfire they had just built, leaning against each other in silence. In the deep desert night, the sound of horses chewing dry grass, the chirping of insects, and two hands clasped tightly, the beginning of a quiet counteroffensive, sowing seeds of hope directly into the ashes. The sun rose slowly, a liquid gold pouring over the dazzling white salt flats beside Drybone Creek. Elijah's herd's hooves clattered, their breath forming faint clouds in the cold morning air. In the distance, the adobe walls of the Fort Garland outpost gradually appeared low, gray with knots, but as steadfast as a promise. Here, guns had to ask the flag's permission before firing. The wooden gate creaked open. The sentry on duty recognized Elijah and let out a long whistle. "You bring in the whole ranch this time." Elijah just tipped his hat, a slight smile on his lips. Opal rode close beside him, her shoulder brushing his. A strange feeling. People usually avoided soldiers, yet here they were, heading into the fortress as if coming home. In the courtyard, Captain Ellis, his blue uniform adorned with a silver star, shook Elijah's hand. "Rumor in the saloons was you were dead in a Red Canyon gulch last night, and here you are this morning, driving 100 young Mustangs to my gate." Ellis half smiled, glancing at Opal. "The missus, co-owner of the ranch." Elijah replied curtly. Opal just nodded, hiding her salt-dusted hands in her coat pockets. The transaction was swift. Ellis selected the 6 strongest horses, paying $200 in gold up front, along with 3 crates of nails, 10 sheets of tin roofing, and a roll of barbed wire. "Boone, don't ask for paperwork." He winked. "The quartermaster has a surplus. Just consider it a security deposit against supply raiders." Elijah understood. The army was willing to help, as long as he kept Red Canyon as a safe buffer zone. An outpost doctor, Ramirez, was asked to look at the cut on Opal's cheek. He applied a light iodine solution, squinting, not deep, but it'll scar if you don't apply some armadillo grease every night. Opal smiled. A scar tells a better story than a mirror. Elijah gave her a slight wink the first time she'd seen a hint of humor in his eyes. At noon, the bugle call for assembly echoed across the yard. The brassy sound struck a memory of that fiery afternoon in Tennessee, and Elijah stood frozen. The vein in his neck throbbed, his hand gripping his hat so tightly that Opal gently placed her palm on his back and whispered, "It's just music. We're winning, not losing." The warmth through the fabric eased the tension in his muscles. He took a deep breath of horse smell, the faded scent of gunpowder in the laughter of the guards. As the sun began to set, they left Fort Garland. Ellis gave them a temporary permit for hauling goods and 2 sealed crates of gunpowder. To blast rock in the canyon if you need to. He winked. Or to fire a celebratory cannon if you manage to survive again. Opal wasn't sure which part was a joke. 50 miles away, Jarvis Langdon stood before a giant pit of ash, what was left of the Boone Ranch. He threw his cigar butt onto the scorched earth and roared. Boone escaped. "Whoever gave me the wrong report is a dead man." Beside him, Ace Delgado, a bounty hunter from Texas, with a waxed mustache, silently put his binoculars away. "Still saw campfire smoke by Drybone Creek this morning. Those horses are a sign Boone's still alive." Jarvis narrowed his eyes. "Bring me his head, or bring me his new ranch blown to bits. Double the pay." Delgado nodded without haggling. He looked at the distant dust trail, his eyes cold with calculation. That night, Opal and Elijah camped under a grove of cottonwood trees along the bank of Drybone Creek. The fire crackled. The pot of beans bubbled. Elijah pulled a stack of hand-sized pine planks from his saddlebag. "Their surface is smooth. For the new walls. You draw the plans. I'll build." Opal's pencil sketched quickly. A horse stable. Area feed store. Libya's store. A kitchen corner. A well with a wooden cover. She slowed her pencil at a small square next to the main door, then blushed and hid the drawing. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "A nursery." She nodded slightly. The campfire flared, the orange light making her cheeks glow like poppy petals. He said nothing, but took the pencil and drew a round window facing the sunrise. After their meal, Opal found the medicine Ramirez had given her and applied it to her cheek. The scent of mint was sharp. Elijah lay on his back, his head pillowed on his saddle, looking at the sky. Clara used to love counting the stars. She said the sky was full of bullet holes, and God patched them with light. Opal put the jar down and sat beside him. "I believe God patches wounds with people, like how you gave me the gloves, or how I put medicine on your arm." Elijah tilted his head, his gray eyes warm. "Then let's keep patching each other up until the seams are strong." Opal smiled, pulling the Union Army blanket over his shoulders and her own. The night wind whistled, but in the tight confines of the blanket, the distance between their 2 heartbeats grew shorter. In the early morning, they led the herd across the salt flats. The sky was the color of lead, a southern storm threatening. Elijah turned to Opal. "The direct route will run into Langdon. Going around means 2 more days, and we're short on water." Opal frowned, then remembered the 2 crates of gunpowder Ellis had sent. Blast the small cliff open a new path along the river. Elijah considered it, then nodded. They chose a thin limestone cliff, planted the fuse, and laid a long, slow-burning cord. Elijah urged Opal to hide behind a rock, but she stood shoulder to shoulder with him. "If the bugle's bullets couldn't kill you, this explosion won't kill me either." He laughed, the first real, resounding laugh Opal had ever heard, and lit the fuse. The explosion echoed down the dry riverbed, rock dust billowing into a gray cloud. When the smoke cleared, a narrow path just wide enough for a horse to follow along the water's edge was revealed. Elijah looked like a boy who had just gotten a Christmas present. They drove the herd through, leaving Drybone Creek before the 3rd dawn, heading towards the wide plains that led back to Red Canyon from the north. At noon, the storm clouds gathered, lightning zigzagging. Opal rode Molly, the wind whipping her hair like a lash. Elijah was behind her, his Spencer slung across his back. The thunder drowned out the sound of hooves, but in the misty rain, he caught a glimpse of a rider following them, a chestnut-colored leather duster, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his eyes, Ace Delgado. At his hip hung a double-barreled silver pistol engraved with a gleaming D. Elijah reined in his horse, changed formation, and sent Opal ahead with the herd to the top of a hill. He turned his rifle and waited. Delgado didn't shoot. He tipped his hat back, a faint smile on his face. "Boone, certainly remenin. Jarvis is tired of hunting dreams. Now he's hunting your neck. Leave the horses. Sign over the land, and I'll spare your life." Elijah answered with a bullet that kicked up dirt in front of Delgado's horse. The herd spooked. "Timur Nitronen," Delgado fired back, but the wind sent his bullet wide. Opal shouted, driving the herd across a shallow creek. The Mustangs created a screen of muddy water, obscuring their target. Elijah fired cover shots, slowly retreating. Delgado spurred his horse in pursuit, but the path was narrow and the rocks were slick. A shout, his horse slipped. Scrambling for balance, Delgado froze, pulling the reins. His eyes red with anger. By dusk, Elijah and Opal had forced the herd into a narrow rock chasm, as sharp as a blade cut into the back of Red Canyon. The rain poured down, water lashed down, turning the red earth into a stream of fresh red. They took shelter under a rock ledge. The herd huddled and trembling. Opal tied a rope around a post, her eyes scanning the narrow path. He won't dare enter this path. Too much risk of a rock slide, but he'll circle up to the ridge to block the exit. Elijah nodded, lighting a small oil lamp to look at a makeshift map. "We'll create a diversion. You take the horses along the old waterway to Morningstar Plain. I'll climb the cliff. Set a charge on the ledge. The falling rocks will block him." Opal grabbed his arm. "You alone?" He gave a weary smile. "God patches wounds with people, but someone has to stand clear of the falling rocks to do the patching later." Opal paused, then grabbed his collar and pulled him close. "Live, even if it's without an arm, just live." He nodded, his lips brushing her wet hair for a brief moment. The rain stopped as night fell. Elijah climbed the cliff, the wind biting at his flesh. At the top, he set the charge and waited for the sound of hooves. In the ravine below, Opal led the herd along the dry waterway. With each step, her heart beat out his name. Just as Delgado led 5 men up to the ridge, Elijah pulled the cord, rocks shattered and rolled like a herd of mad buffalo. Gunshots rang out. Horses whinnied. Men shouted. A large boulder crashed next to Delgado. Throwing him from his horse, the silver pistol flew from his hand. In the cloud of dust, Elijah rolled down the edge. His wrist sprained, but the red earth held him like an embrace. Opal heard the explosion and looked back, seeing only a curtain of dust. Fear choked her, but she kept leading the herd forward because he had told her to. After passing through the Morningstar Gap, the plains opened up, the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers. She tied the herd in a circle of sourwood trees, then returned alone to the canyon. In the darkness, the dust slowly settled. Elijah emerged, limping, his sleeve torn. Opal ran to him, tears mixing with the dust. He gave a tired smile. Just a sprained wrist. And Delgado, in the distance, Wikurdasurim, under a sliver of broken moon, a horse staggered away, riderless. Opal held him tight. He'll tell Langdon. The red earth can't bury Boone. They returned to Morningstar Plain and built a fire to dry their clothes. Elijah bandaged his hand, asking Opal to button his shirt. Her hand trembled slightly, but the round wooden buttons fit perfectly with each turn. He watched her frown in concentration and smiled softly. "Were you this diligent in the classroom?" She replied, "When a student secretly drew a cow with wings, I smiled even more." He touched her cheek, the new scar pulling the young skin. "A scar tells a story, right?" She looked up, her lips forming a weary smile, but her eyes blazed with the fire of dusk. The herd slept, their heads in a circle, on the wet grass. Elijah and Opal leaned against each other, listening to the insects return after the rain. The crescent moon cut through the sky, stitching the gray clouds together. Opal placed a hand on her stomach, just a habit to quell her anxiety. But Elijah gently covered her hand with his. After a storm, the earth nourishes the seeds better. She looked up at him, her heart beating 2 slow thumps. In the distance, Red Canyon was painted a silver gray in the night. Those ashes would become the fertilizer for Boone's blessing, the name they had chosen for the ranch born from the ashes. Ahead lay Langdon, the county court, the cracked earth, but tonight, on Morningstar Plain, 2 people who had once been cursed now breathed the same new air, thick with the smell of wet earth. Horses and hope. And they knew, tomorrow morning, when the sun poured gold onto the grass, they would lead their herd back to Red Canyon, redrawing the boundaries of their dream with the wooden posts Ellis had promised, building a home that smelled of mint, and letting the crows call. The red dust would still tell the story. Here, blood and ash had just written the beginning of a rebirth. The dawn cast a pale orange hue over Morningstar Plain. The post-storm wind was clean of gunpowder smoke, leaving only the sharp, damp scent of grass. Opal woke the herd with a long whistle. They shook their manes, sending misty halos of water into the sunlight. Elijah propped himself up on his bandaged elbow, tightening a brass buckle. A sharp pain shot through his wrist with every turn, but he smiled as sundown nuzzled his shoulder, as if to say, the road home isn't finished yet. Old man, he patted the horse's forehead, his brown eyes glinting with promise. They split the herd into 3 groups. Opal led the young colts, Elijah watched over the strong breeding stock, and Molly pulled the wagon laden with lumber, and tin, and gunpowder supplied by the army. The northern route back to Red Canyon wound through jagged catclaw rocks, but it was safe from Jarvis Langdon. On the afternoon of the second day, the familiar cracked Red Canyon walls appeared. The roof of the old ranch was now a giant mound of gray ash, still smoldering under the sun. Opal dismounted, stooped to pick up a handful of charred earth, and smelled it carefully. Tar, nitri, inomine, and even the ash of burned moss. She stood up, her thin duster coat fluttering in the wind. Her voice as firm as a driven nail. If it's burnt, we clear it. The ash makes the soil rich. Elijah looked at her, then walked over and drove the first pine post into the ashen ground, striking it with a hammer. The sharp thwack-thwack echoed through the canyon like a drum calling troops to assemble. Duke, the one-eared dog, trotted out from the cacti. Barking hoarsely and wagging his tail, Opal laughed, stroking Duke's neck and whispering, "You're the foreman now, old-timer." Late in the afternoon, the sound of hooves came from the foothills. The owner of the Thistle Saloon, Old Stackson the blacksmith, and even Maeve Carter the herb seller arrived with 2 wagons carrying canvas tents, wooden planks, hanach sereniner, black bread, and a keg of barley beer. Pastor Greaves didn't come, but he sent his youngest son with 10 bags of cement and a brief note. "The Lord teaches us to mend what is broken." Opal bit her lip, her eyes welling, and tucked the note into her bodice. The villagers toiled, digging foundations and mixing cement amidst a storm of insects rising from the damp earth. Opal squatted, drawing chalk lines on a plank, marking kitchen, high shed, and a tiny nursery tucked at the end of the row. No one asked, but everyone smiled when they saw Elijah lean on his hammer, looking at that particular sign a little longer than necessary. On the first night on the ashen ground, everyone gathered around the fire. Maeve boiled a pot of corn stew, adding bay leaves for fragrance. Old Stackson tapped the beer keg. Ellis had sent 2 soldiers to stand temporary guard, setting up a green canvas tent and raising the stars and stripes in the yard. Under the flag's shadow, Opal brewed mint tea, placing 2 cups side by side as was her old habit. But tonight, besides Elijah, there was also Stackson, Maeve, Widatarunawan, and even Deputy Clive Harrington, who had ridden out to check on them. Opal simply poured more water. There was enough mint for the whole crew. In the quiet night, they listened to the crackling wood and to Edith, the widowed owner of the general store, telling ghost stories of the canyon. Everyone chuckled, but their hearts tightened at the thought of Jarvis Langdon still lurking. Elijah flicked a piece of kindling, and the embers flared orange. "Tomorrow we build the stable first, then the ammunition shed. In the afternoon, I want everyone to go back to town, only Opal, and I will watch the ranch, lest Langdon think we've grown careless with numbers." Harrington sipped his beer and nodded. "The county is gathering evidence. Simon confessed everything, but Langdon hired a lawyer from Topeka. He might slip away before he ever sees a courtroom." Opal looked at the embers, her voice calm. "If he slips away, his other hand is still strong enough to pull a trigger. We aren't building this ranch to challenge him, but to have a place to sell milk, turnips, and lull the storm to sleep." Everyone fell silent. Then old Stackson slammed his wooden mug on a log. "Then we build to lull the storm to sleep." Laughter and the clinking of mugs followed, the firelight reflecting a determination as thick as a stone wall. At dawn, Red Canyon awoke to the sound of hammers and saws. Opal climbed the scaffolding, framing the round window that faced the sunrise. Elijah hammered down the tin roofing, each blow sending pain through his wrist, but he didn't slow his rhythm. Corporal Wells strung barbed wire around the ammunition shed, posting a warning sign. Duke barked fiercely whenever he caught a strange scent. Opal rewarded him with a piece of cinnamon biscuit, calling him head of security. By the 3rd noon, the kitchen roof was finished. Stable frame was solid, and the hay shed was filled chest high. Ellis sent a wagon with lime and 3 more soldiers to help. The ranch now looked like a bustling, expanding anthill. That afternoon, Maeve saw a trail of black smoke from the peak of South Fork towards Dustvale, an urgent signal. Opal and Elijah looked at each other, a signal from Mrs. Carter, Okananamontarda. Dangers on the move. Elijah ordered the kitchen fire extinguished, the gunpowder hidden, and the villagers evacuated back to Dustvale before sunset. Everyone scattered into the canyon, leaving only Opal. Elijah, and sundown. The wind brought the smell of acrid nitro and cigar ash sooner than expected. The moon had not yet risen high when the sound of hooves beat on the flattened sand. Jarvis Langdon rode a sleek black horse, followed by a shoulder-bandaged Ace Delgado and 7 newly hired guns. Langdon stopped 10 paces from the barbed wire fence, smiling to reveal yellow teeth. Tananbun, idananinuantum. The land is already cracked. Why bother building? Sign it over, warrant, and I'll pay you triple the army's price. Elijah stood behind the fence, his Spencer resting on his shoulder, his voice low. You've sent snakes, blown up my stable, and set fuses 3 times. That's a price I'm not selling at. Langdon laughed, but his eyes were cold. Then I'll count to 10. After that, this land will be ownerless once again. Opal stepped forward, holding a leather pouch bulging with a gray powder. Do you know about flash powder? Her voice was calm wood ash mixed with saltpeter and sulfur. The stuff you left behind after you burned the stable? I collected all of it. Langdon's eyes narrowed. Opal gently shook the pouch. Gray dust fell into the wind, catching on the flames of his men's torches and flaring with a crackling green light. A few of the hired guns jerked their horses back. This whole field is the charge. Do you want to strike the match? Langdon tightened his reins, about to give the signal, when Duke let out a long howl. From the darkness, Molly charged out, pulling the wagon Ellis had sent. 2 barrels of gunpowder with their fuses exposed. Elijah threw a lit ember onto the slow fuse, the flame crawling up the oil-soaked cord. He roared. One more step, and Red Canyon becomes a sea of fire. Before your nitro can go off, my ash will... Delgado cursed and started to draw his gun, but Langdon raised a hand. Fall back. He spat a stream of wine-red saliva, his eyes fixed on Opal with venom. School teacher. Ash only explodes once. I'll be back with a cannon. Elijah yanked the cord, pulling the fuse from the gunpowder, and the flame hissed out. Langdon rode away, the dust from his horses obscuring the moon. When the sound of hooves faded, Opal's hands fell, and the gray ash scattered and dissolved in the wind. She stood stunned, the full weight of the tension finally crashing down on her. Elijah placed his good hand on her back. He'll be back. But now the whole town knows exactly what he is. That night, though he was on watch, Elijah quietly installed the round window frame that was still missing its glass. Opal brought out a piece of glass she had carefully wrapped in dustvale. On it, she had painted a crescent moon outlined in silver. When the glass was set, the crescent moon caught the firelight from the kitchen, casting a warm, glowing arc on the pine wall that smelled of resin. Elijah whispered, "The storm is sleeping peacefully." In the early morning, the road from Dustvale was dusty with people. Pastor Greaves walked at the head of the procession, wearing a rough-spun robe, carrying a Bible and a shovel. Behind him was a crowd of men and women carrying bricks, tiles, and old-school desks. When Greaves reached the gate, Opal was so stunned she took half a step back. Her father looked down at the scar on his daughter's cheek in the sunlight, his lips trembling. He handed her the shovel and said only, "This land needs someone who knows how to sow letters and sow courage. Teacher, let me be your apprentice." Opal bit her lip, then smiled through a screen of tears. She plunged the shovel into the ashen earth with a solid thud. Other shovels rose and fell in unison. The new porch roof extended, and the new fence posts were driven straight on the gatepost. The wooden sign carved with Boone's blessing was rehung, this time coated with a gleaming layer of pine oil, the color of amber. The southerly wind blew through, carrying the scent of mint from the garden and the smell of burnt earth. Merging into a fragrance only Red Canyon possessed the smell of a new beginning. Far to the south, Jarvis Langdon growled as he loaded a field cannon he had just bought illegally. But to the north, Fort Garland had also received a report of heavy weaponry threatening a civilian area. The news reached Ellis at the same time the sun shone through the round window of the nursery, casting a light on Opal's cheek. glowing like a prophecy. Old ashes feed new sprouts, and the next battle would no longer be fought alone. The summer wind blew across the slopes of North Ridge, carrying the gentle scent of sun-scorched earth mixed with the moisture of a brief midday rain. At the foot of the mountain, the Boone Ranch, newly built 3 months prior, stood as firm as a vow made of pine. Its tin roof gleamed silver. Ivy had yet to fully take root on the porch columns, and the Boone's blessing sign hung with a proud air. Opal stood in the middle of the yard, one hand gently supporting the roundness of her belly, hidden beneath a simple cotton dress. The late-day sun painted her cheeks a peachy hue, highlighting the faint scar left by the rattlesnake, a thin thread connecting a bitter past to a hopeful present. Near the new stable, Elijah set down his hammer, dusting wood shavings from his shoulders. His injured wrist was still bandaged, but each chisel strike was as even, firm, and decisive as the sound of hooves from his time as a cavalry commander. "The main beam is set," he said, his voice thick with dust. "We'll finish the roof tomorrow, just in time for the change of seasons." Opal smiled and stepped across the cracked earth threshold. Since the old ash had mixed with the new mortar, every crack sprouted a tiny blade of grass. She bent down, pinched a young mint leaf, and inhaled its cool, sharp scent. The fragrance that had replaced morphine, replaced the Bible, and even replaced the unspoken declarations of love between her and Elijah. He came to her side, his uninjured hand taking hers. Their fingertips were still dotted with white lime. Elijah gently placed his other hand on Opal's belly, feeling the faint movement of the tiny life within. His eyes gray ash mixed with amber welled with a shimmering moisture. "Our child won't remember anything about the war, or the times the stable burned. Will they?" Opal shook her head, her voice soft. "Our child will only know the sound of a school bell and the whinny of horses in the morning. I promise." From the kitchen, Duke the old one-eared dog barked hoarsely, announcing the late afternoon. Opal went inside to start the fire, cooking a pot of stew with freshly picked kale. Elijah sat on the porch step, carving a tiny cradle from the wood of a fallen cypress, the very tree that had sheltered him and Clara from the flames the day the old ranch burned. Wood shavings flew, landing on his boots like early snow, as the sunset dipped the entire canyon in a brilliant copper color. Opal brought 2 bowls of soup out to the porch. The wind gently swayed her old slingshot, making a familiar clack. They ate in silence, listening to the distant screech of bats, the sky filled with stars, the night's dome arching like a giant tent. Elijah set his bowl down and pulled from his pocket a rough silver ring he had just forged. Its surface was as smooth as well water, not yet polished. "I never gave you a ring," he whispered. "On our wedding day, we didn't have one." Opal held out her hand. The silver band slid over her knuckle and settled on her finger. It felt as perfectly fitting as a kitchen, small enough to be warm, but not suffocating. She smiled gently. "Now I'll give one back." She untied from her neck a leather cord holding a handkerchief Clara had patched in her childhood, a piece of brown cloth singed at the edges by fire, and tied it around his bandaged wrist. "So you remember, Sir Circus, old ashes help wounds to heal." A southerly wind rolled through, rattling a wind chime made of mustard seed pods. The tinkling sound was reminiscent of a distant church bell, but more rustic, more private. Opal leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the ridge where the silver scar of the firework-lit night of the ranch explosion was still etched. Now in one harbor of Sayersawan, only the Milky Way was a faint swath, like an endless road waiting for them to walk with their child. Elijah began to sing Shenandoah softly. Opal harmonized, her clear, smoky voice weaving behind his deep, sandy baritone, 2 voices intertwining as naturally as 2 rivers merging. When the final note faded into the wind, she said slowly, "My time is near. If I grow weak, don't be afraid. The mint is on the high shelf. The water is boiling in the cast iron pot. And Duke knows how to bark for Dum Carter," he sniffed. "You'll be fine. You've walked through rattlesnakes, sandstorms, and a lynch mob. A baby is nothing." He took his wife's hand and pressed it to his heart. "But just to be sure, I've already picked out names. If it's a girl, Clara Josie, for your nickname and my mother. If it's a boy, Billy Matthew, for your first young student and your father." Opal laughed, her eyes brimming with tears. "Either name is full of meaning, the child will grow up strong." They sat like that for a long time, until the new moon rose above the cliff, hanging its silver sickle directly over the round window of the nursery. a sliver of light illuminating the new floor. Swaying like a boat on a still lake, Elijah stood and helped Opal inside. They turned off the oil lamp, leaving only the glow from the fireplace, a rosy light shimmering like the embryo of a new day. Near midnight, the first contraction hit Opal. She bit her lip and shook Elijah awake. He shot up, lit the lamp, fumbling in his haste but his hands steady. The eyes that had seen battle years ago were now strangely calm. Duke barked sharply and dashed outside. Less than 10 minutes later, the sound of hooves filled the yard doctor. Maeve Carter had arrived, her cloak flying like a kite. In the newly whitewashed room, the oil lamp burned brightly. Opal gripped Elijah's hand, squeezing until her knuckles turned white. Pain rolled through her like waves, and with each respite, she inhaled the scent of mint from a warm cloth he had quickly dipped. Maeve counted the rhythms, gently encouraging, "That's it, my red dust girl." Near dawn, a faint cry broke the silence, bursting forth like a spring from its source. Elijah leaned down, his hands trembling as he received the slippery, "Warm baby." "Hey, girl," Maeve whispered, her eyes wet. He placed the child on Opal's chest, his voice choked. "Welcome, Sarm, Clara Josie Boone." Outside, the sky was just beginning to brighten, an amber hue spreading across the mountainside. Opal, her hair damp with sweat, looked up through the crescent moon window. In the rosy sky, the red dust of years past was now covered with a fine layer of green grass. Elijah sat beside her, resting his forehead against his wife's, and smiled softly. The dawn really did rise from the ashes, didn't it? Esfuerzo. Opal, exhausted but happy, nodded. She gently turned her husband's wrist, letting the old handkerchief touch their daughter's skin. The tiny smile that had just formed lit up the whole room, brighter than the oil lamp, brighter than the moon, brighter than anything Red Canyon had ever known. Beyond the window, the early wind brushed the scent of mint around the tin roof and gently rattled the wooden Boone's blessing sign, making a deep, warm sound a perfect match to the rhythm of 3 heartbeats. And in that moment, Elijah and Opal understood that the story they had built from red dust, ash, a Spencer rifle, a Damascus dagger, a mint-scented slingshot, and a belated kiss had finally come full circle. From now on, the story of Red Canyon would be told through the cries and then the laughter of Clara Josie, and no longer by gunfire or torment. On the porch, the sun rose above the old cypress trees, spreading a carpet of early morning light across the ranch roof, casting a golden streak upon the pine cradle Elijah had carved the night before. In that sunbeam, the gentle scent of mint rose, mingling with the faint smell of mother's milk in the room, the smell of beginnings, of warmth, of peace. The valley of red dust, once scorched and bitter, now smiled,